many of these prints. A little bit of my background: I specialize in women artists from the early 20th century, and especially those working on paper. That's really my prime interest. And I'm working on curating a show on 2 other women artists that were working during Laurencin's time for a museum in the US. In 2029, it's opening, that we're starting now. And so anyway, doing my research for them overlapped a little bit with my research for Laurencin, and we met at a print fair, and we're chatting kind of about these mutual interests and the idea for this tour. So without further ado, we'll just start downstairs. Yes. Chariots and their drivers, some say foot soldiers, some say ships are the most beautiful things of all. But I say it is that one thing that anyone passionately loves. It's really quite easy to make this understandable to everyone, this thing. You see, that woman who was by far supreme in beauty among all mortals, Helen, she left her best of all husbands, him she left behind, and sailed to Troy, caring not about her daughter and her dear parents, not caring at all. She was swept along. All this reminds me right now of Anactoria. She is not here, and oh, how I would far rather wish to see her taking a dancing step that arouses passionate love, and to see the luminous, radiant look on her face, than to see those chariots of the Lydians and the foot soldiers in their armor as they fight battle. So, Sappho was one of the first poets we know of to write vivid and emotional poetry in first person. She made a name for herself writing about love, separation, and grief. And she was born in 612 BCE in Eresos, a village in the Greek island of Lesbos, off the coast of Turkey. So she lived during a turbulent period of war, and she really isolated herself from all of this, creating a kind of small community for women to learn and dance and write poetry. And we know of her just from remnants of her poetry that have survived. Sappho, so she was already celebrated early on in history after her death. And then here, this is Natalie Barney, who we'll talk about a lot today. She's quite a character in Paris. This is her with her girlfriend dressed up as Prince Charming and I don't know what. And this is her girlfriend Renee Vivian, who was a British poet living in Paris at the time. Her Picasso's friend, follower of Cubism. But recently, a lot of art historians started digging a bit deeper to figure out, who she really was in her essence outside of her associations with these famous male figures. And there's just mountains and mountains of information, so you kind of wonder why this wasn't done before, but we're happy that it's been done now. While she did follow a little bit of the Cubist style, which you can see in here, it's certainly here, she starts to go into her own route a little bit later. And her later style, which you can kind of see here, was interpreted by some as a feminine style, this kind of delicate, flowery imagery, but it was largely misinterpreted as a kind of a naive female depicting pretty women, where there was a real vocabulary and symbolism behind a lot of it that I'll get into that wasn't as known. And part of the reason why she was interpreted this way for so long is the way that Picasso and Apollinaire described her to other people. For example, Apollinaire once described her as a delicate version of himself. He said, "She is happy, she is good, she is spiritual, and she has so much talent. My little son, she is me in feminine form." So she was so much more than Apollinaire in feminine form. And so we'll dive into that a little bit today. So what we have is dialogue with this group, with Picasso and the boys, let's say, early on. There's a famous work by Picasso called the Demoiselles d'Avignon that is at MoMA, done in 1907. That was the year that Picasso met Laurencin. And rumors spread within their group that the figure in the bottom right, this is a brothel scene, by the way, that Picasso is depicting. In the bottom right is a woman with her legs spread wide open. And there's a reference in one of the books that Apollinaire wrote, saying that, talking about a brothel that bombs had fell on, and that the woman was sadly like exploded, and when her legs were wide open like an open book was a phrase in the book. And rumor spread within their group that this character was a veiled reference to Laurencin, his girlfriend that they were continuously fighting and having, you know, big brawls in front of everybody in the studios. And so Picasso, hearing this, talks about Laurencin quite a bit, and rumor gets out that this figure in the bottom right is Laurencin. And Laurencin's not pleased about these rumors. And so, you know, she kind of fights back with her own imagery of herself in paintings and in drawings, and especially in prints. Prints being more private and less expensive to create, she could be more experimental and personal than in her paintings. But in this large painting, she paints herself, again, in the bottom right, at an angle, looking directly out at the viewer, but owning her own image, and at a piano. With Apollinaire, with Picasso, and his eyes are kind of look like the figures of the women in his own Demoiselle, so there's a little bit of a kind of poke there. And in the print behind us that she did in 1907, in reference to yet another male figure in the history of art, Edouard Manet, and his famous painting, Luncheon on the Grass, that is in Musée d'Orsay. And anybody looking at art at the time would have seen that this print would have known the iconography of this painting. And this painting represents two men in a garden with a woman nude, a prostitute. And it was a scandal at its time because it was representing a kind of naked figure looking at the viewers in the eye, unashamed, unabashed. And the figure in the work is Victorine Morand. Now, Victorine Morand was also an artist, and she was known, unfortunately, more as a muse, and for her model work, much like Laurencin. So she sort of identifies a bit with this female figure that was kind of her real role in artistry is pushed aside and only celebrated for this part of her life. Victorine Morand was also bisexual, and her lesbian identity was also kind of swept aside, and so Laurencin also could have, you know, identified with that somewhat. And so in her print, you see a kind of play on this painting where Laurencin's depicting herself in the bottom right, and again looking directly out at the viewer, unashamed. You see the Pont de Passy, which is in the 16th arrondissement in Paris, and instead of the two men, she's got a little cat and a monkey by her side. And, you know, the cat has this just wonderful little angular face that mimics her angular face. So there's formal kind of things that she's creating with a tree that makes the eyes circle around the whole work over and over. But this iconography in it, if you don't know the stories, you don't know the people, you don't maybe catch it. But if you do, there's quite a lot in there. Also, the cat could be making reference to the French word chat, which means pussy, and so which in English and in French has its other connotations. And so, you know, you've got a whole playful thing going on, but also a very serious commentary on who she is in the world of art history and just this. Laurencin made her first prints early in her career in 1904, when she etched Song of Bilitis. In it, two women kiss in an ethereal setting. The print illustrated an edition of Pierre Lewis's book of the same title, first published in 1894. The book claimed to be translations of poems by a woman named Bilitis, a contemporary and lover of Sappho. It included 93 poems. The introduction explained how a German archaeologist found her tomb on the island of Cyprus, and the walls were adorned in her poetry. Lewis was thus offering for the first time to the French public translations of this German's findings. The romantic poems about the love and passion between women captivated modern Paris. The problem was, Bilitis never existed. The poems were a complete forgery, devised by Lewis, the translator. To give the whole story weight, he included a fake bibliography of works supporting his research. He did, however, have a good understanding of the classics and sprinkled a couple real quotes from actual period poets to give it credibility, such as those by Sappho. But to his surprise, when the fraud was discovered, it did little to change people's interest in the poems. His celebration of lesbian sexuality earned him sensation, and he published 4 editions in the first 5 years and continuously ever since. In the front of his book, he dedicated the Songs of Brightest, quote, to the young women of the future society. Sapphic references and strong female archetypes are woven throughout Laurencin's work from 1904 onward. Laurencin was a friend of Lewis, so they worked together on the illustrations for the 1904 printing of the book. Natalie Barney, the woman that we talked about before who went on her extravagant trip to Lesbos, was also a friend, and after the book's success, she founded a club for writers known as Sappho's 1900. 2 years later, in response to Lewis's dedication of his Song of Brightest to the young woman of the future society, Barney wrote a book called 5 Little Greek Dialogues and dedicated it to Lewis from, quote, a young woman of the future society. So who was this Natalie Barney? Barney was born in Ohio, where I'm from, so I'm proud, to a wealthy railroad car manufacturing family. And she first began to care about women's rights when she was traveling with her mother. She just was horrified at the way that women were treated. She felt that they were kind of treated like mules and given no independence. And her father was, unfortunately, heavy on the booze and not very present for her, and didn't really encourage her mother's artistic side. Her mother was also a painter, nor his daughter's eccentricities. So she really felt this urge to kind of change something in this dynamic. She wanted to make a contribution. And one of those contributions was to be transparent about female desires and intellect in a really repressed age. Her courage inspired many who followed in her footsteps, such as Marie Laurencin. The brilliant French writer Colette, who too had many female lovers, wrote to Barney, "I often reflect that nothing has come to me from you, great or small, that has not been good." Barney was bilingual from a young age, so she spoke French fluently, and we imagine that she spoke to Laurencin in French. She once said, "Being bilingual is like having a wife and a mistress. One can never be sure of the other." But she wrote fluently in French, publishing 5 volumes of poetry, 3 epigrams, 2 essays, and 3 memoirs. When Barney's father passed away finally, she inherited a pithy $75 million in today's dollars. And she and her mother lived an unbridled high life in Paris with that. She began writing and met the notorious French courtesan Lily de Pougy while riding in horseback in Bois de Boulogne. So apparently she rode often with her horse around Bois de Boulogne and met escorts and other women. And Lily de Pougy was known by the public in general, so this particular affair captured the eyes and hearts of anybody in the know. And then Laurencin would have undoubtedly known about this book. She would have undoubtedly known about kind of Natalie Barney's exploits in the Bois de Boulogne on horseback, and this idea of a strong woman kind of going on exploits and adventures would have been a nod that people would have understood. Another reference in this print undoubtedly is the famous French noblewoman Diane de Poitiers, who liked to have herself painted as the naked goddess Diana. So she had, who was the goddess of the hunt. So she's referencing probably both of these figures, Natalie Barney, certainly Diane de Poitiers, and of course the goddess herself, the huntress, Diana. And then if you look closely, you see there's not only Diana nude on horseback, and maybe even a self-portrait of a bit, because you see the same angular features that she portrays in the woman in the other room. You have a little doe, a deer in the front, and that she includes in a lot of her work from this point forward. And doe, deer in French, is la biche, and biche is also a coded reference to lesbian. So that was another way of referring to lesbian at the time. So there are all these kind of winks and nods to this female culture. Now, Laurencin was not strictly lesbian, she was bisexual. She had many male lovers and female lovers. She ultimately stayed mostly with women after her divorce, which I'll talk about later. But there was a part of her identity at this time that was almost repressed and shown primarily in prints, and then lives kind of out more fully later after the war when she has a lover in Spain and she leaves her husband, and then she doesn't get married ever again, and she kind of freely portrays women at that point, that you'll see in the later works as she's sort of accepting that part of her identity a little bit more. So in 1909, Natalie, at 33 years old, moves into this beautiful home on the 20 Rue Jacob that's still there in Paris today, where she lived for 60 years. And on the front is a party with American food and celebrated Laurencin's birthday, which fell on the 31st. The writer Paul Valéry referred to these Friday afternoons at the Temple of Friendship as the Hazardous Fridays. Her guest list, some included in a drawing by Barney here, reads like a roll call of the brilliant writers and artists of the period. Laurencin's equestrian references in her work are certainly nods to Barney and the lifestyle she came to represent. The Amazon nickname that Barney started to be called the Amazon came from Rémy de Gourmont, who was a symbolist poet, novelist, and critic whose face was badly disfigured by lupus. Ashamed, he took refuge in his apartment and writing from home and rarely went out in public. So Barney hears this and takes pity on him and goes to his apartment regularly to kind of give him the gossip of the day, take him out on her horse in the Bois de Boulogne, and speak about literature and whatnot. And he sort of falls in love with her, her intellect, but also I think a little bit just her in general. She respected his kind heart and his brilliant mind as well. He was an incredible writer and once described his clear blue eyes as, quote, 2 children living in ruin. In awe of her kindness, her beauty, and rejuvenated by their conversations, de Gourmont composed a letter to Natalie every 2 weeks in the French newspaper Mercure de France, but called it Letters to an Amazon, so didn't reference her by name, between January of 1912 and October of 1913. It placed her in the same category as the legendary race of female warriors believed by the ancient Greeks to live along the Black Sea or the edge of the world. Anyone in the know knew it referred to Natalie Barney. After the Amazon paintings, years later in 1950, Laurencin made a series of 23 Sappho etchings in the spirit of these garden gatherings. And I'm currently translating all of Gourmand's letters to Natalie into English. So to publish them, because the last version was done in the 60s and it's out of print. So between 1909 and 1913, Natalie was this known entity in Paris. Her hazardous parties were a place where Laurencin and others went and met like-minded creatives. And in the famous scandalized book, Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, published in 1928, the author modeled the character Valerie after Barney, describing her as, quote, a kind of lighthouse in a storm-swept ocean, giving courage to others. So, on that note, we move to Eugenie, Greek mythology, and I don't know if you can see, well, can everybody see? Okay. So the story of Iphigenie is basically Agamemnon wants to go off to war and Troy, and he can't get there because his sails won't catch the wind. And so the goddess Diana says to him, you know what, you actually upset me, you killed one of my deer while you were hunting, and so I took all the wind out of your sails, so you can't go. And the only way that you're going to be able to go is if you sacrifice your firstborn. And he contemplates it, and he's a little upset about the idea, but in the end he says, well, sacrificing my daughter or getting the glory of war and honor, I think we're going to have to sacrifice my daughter. So he sacrifices his eldest, and this is the daughter, Iphigenie, and at the altar, it's said in Euripides' tale, which was then rewritten by Racine in France years later, so it's a story that many of the French were familiar with. In his version, Diana takes pity on her and says, she's horrified that he would glorify the war over his daughter, and even though she caused this whole mess in the first place. And she sweeps down and brings up Iphigenie into her temple, and she becomes one of the, those maidens dedicated to her. And these are the other maidens dedicated to the goddess Diana. And so Laurencin, reinterprets this tale as a kind of story of a woman saved by other women in a safe and peaceful place, Iphigenie was also known for her beauty in the tale, so also Laurencin's kind of paying homage to her beauty. And again, she's depicting Greek stories at a time where she's going to parties at Natalie Barney's house, where they're reenacting Sapphic poems, and they're all kind of in this whole world of idealizing that past. So it's not created within a vacuum at all. There are kind of all of these references inside that work. That was done several years later in 1912 by Laurencin, and it's known as the Romance. And it's known as the Romance primarily because it was the year that she separated from Guillaume Apollinaire. And recently, other scholars have come to kind of think about the work in different ways as not just a depiction of her, of a woman in distress over her breakup, but over a particularly turbulent period in her life, which was when she decided to do an interior design salon in Paris called the Cubist House. And she worked with another designer, André Mar, to do this Cubist house. And it was meant to show an interior, a modern interior. And she had a couple paintings in this modern interior, and it really caused a scandal. People were outraged, they hated this, they said that it was disrupting, kind of bourgeois life, and life interior shouldn't look like that. It was a scandal. And so much so that they stormed the pavilion, and Laurencin had to fight them off with an umbrella with the wife of André Mar. And so she wrote an inscription on another edition that's in a private collection in Paris to Charlotte Mar with very friendly feelings, Marie Laurencin. Since that fateful day, I no longer go to the dance hall because that air, that tune makes me ill. And it's a reference basically to kind of going out that night and being upset about what had happened, also to her breakup with Apollinaire, so it's all unraveled kind of into one, right? And how some scholars have interpreted this is you see a woman with her hands up and her kind of like dress flying, so she's running in one direction, and she's sort of leaving, she's fed up. It's this moment where she says, like, I'm done, and I'm leaving all this behind. She's leaving Apollinaire behind, the Cubists behind, that whole kind of, let's say, like ball and chain that maybe she had to that group, and going to pursue her own identity. And from this moment forward, she really turns, her work turns into a more individual style. And you lose a lot of the Cubist reference and you get more of a kind of Rococo 18th century romantic style mixed with her own modern look. So while I was in France recently, I was digging up some research on these women, and I found some letters from Marie Laurencin to Natalie Barney, because Natalie Barney gave all of her letters to the Jacques Doucet Library in Paris, and it's a testament to how close they really were. She signs, dear, Laurencin signs, dear, I put my head on your shoulder, you're Marie. That's how she signs off, or your Marie kisses you and keeps you for herself. So these were all given to Jacques Doucet, who was a collector and a fashion designer. He was the first one to purchase Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso. And he worked with the designer Paul Poiret. Poiret's younger sister, Nicole Gru, was a friend of Laurencin. She's right here. And there's Nicole, and the painting by Marie above it. And she became her lover during World War I when she was exiled in Spain. So when World War I hit off, Natalie had decided to marry a German artist, and because he was German, she had to take his citizenship at the time. Those were the rules, and so because she had the German identity, she wasn't allowed to live in Paris anymore. Was exiled to Spain, and really cut off from her whole artist community. That's why she's writing kind of letters to Barney, and she's really isolated, and her husband sort of abandons her. Their relationship quickly falls apart, and she is hanging out with Paul Poiret's sister in Spain, and they became lovers, and she starts painting several portraits of her. Gru was a talented fashion designer herself and had launched her own fashion salon in 1911. Laurencin had designed her business card before, so they had this relationship as friends before this relationship developed. Gru's husband was also a successful interior designer and collaborated on projects with Laurencin. And in her paintings of this period, Laurencin uses, you can see here, oh, it's hard. There we go. Here, and you'll see it in other works like exaggerated femininity, long legs, long hands, pointed feet, lots of fabric and drapery. So women hide behind kind of a thin veil of like this constructed girliness that was inoffensive and pleased male viewers, but also winked to those in the know and that kind of knew about that really what they were are kind of this praise of women and their kind of secret world. So other women that contributed to this circle were the artists that I'm studying to do this exhibition on, Mars and Squire. This is a print by Maud Squire, and it represents a hat that all the women were kind of wearing in Paris at the time, designed by Paul Poiret. So again, there's this kind of other connection to Nicole Gru and to Laurencin. You kind of quickly find that there's this one degree of separation between a lot of these women, especially in these kind of lesbian circles, because they find familiarity and closeness with each other and they're really supportive of each other's work. What Mars and Squire learned from Laurencin and from Stein and Barney and also writers like Sylvia Beach, they bring back to American art circles in the United States. And so I'll be talking about kind of how what they brought back from Paris impacted printmaking in the US. So what all these women have in common is that they came to Paris with the goal to pursue their passions, their art, and to live freely, and to share their lives with the women they loved, and to be modern, open, and to ultimately change the course of history. Would so many women who led the feminist movements after the war have had the courage to do so if the suffragettes had not done their earlier work? Had Barney not created her salons at the Temple to Friendship and shamelessly lived freely in all of Paris to see and write about? Had Stein not supported all the artists that she had with her wallet? Or had Sylvia Beach, a friend of theirs, not published and sold the books that so many had forbidden for so long? Or had Laurencin not carved a place for herself among the boys and painted her celebrations of female friendship, love, and sapphic modern life? Would we be where we are today, able to talk about these things so freely? Celebrating individuality and freedom of expression? I don't believe so. And it certainly wouldn't be as fun to talk about. So on that note, I'd like to leave you with a line from Natalie Barney's memoir. Anything difficult to say must be shouted from the rooftops. A work called En Español, and it's referencing her romance with Nicole Gru and kind of all of the Spanish women in her Spanish period at the time. And as you can tell, the women are unashamedly close, right? There's a clearly romantic vibe to them, let's say. And she was way more bold in her prints in representing these type of things. And the paintings at the period, they're a little bit more ambiguous, but there's an intimacy to the prints that make them really special.